Shh, don't let anyone know there's a panel in here. Welcome to the ASMR panel. I'm just going to whisper into this microphone, and everyone will achieve a state of euphoria. Little did you know. All right, we've got about a minute and a half. Let the stragglers walk in. Welcome. Come and sit down. It's safe. Trust me. What could possibly go wrong? God, it is quiet. Okay. All right, I guess we can start a minute early. Hello, everyone. I don't see any more galloping hordes outside, so... greetings, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Crispin Freeman. Thank you so much for coming to join me for my panel today. Before we get started, there's just one little topic I wanted to bring up. This is a topic that actually Yuri Lowenthal was touching on yesterday in his panel with Miley and Tara. And I think my fellow voice actors have been talking about it because it's been an issue that's been coming up a lot. And that has been about safety at conventions and making conventions a safe space for people to enjoy themselves, to celebrate what they appreciate about anime and pop culture, and not to feel put upon or threatened in any way. This has become more and more of an issue. I started going to conventions 20 years ago, which is sort of crazy to think about. Back then, the conventions were a little bit smaller, and most of the people at the convention tended to know each other. It was a smaller group, and so we were all friends. Now, conventions have gotten a little bigger, and there's more people, and so it can sort of feel like a bunch of, massive faces. I'm here to encourage us to keep this a village, to keep groups of friends looking out for each other. Making sure that no one is having to deal with any sort of harassment or anything that is not consensual, right? You may be familiar with the whole movement, cosplay is not consent. The idea being that just because someone is dressed up as your favorite character doesn't mean you get to go up and touch them, right? That you need to be able to communicate with people, and that people need to feel safe, that people need to be able to go to friends, go to official people at the convention, and tell them if something inappropriate is happening. Because it's very important that this whole environment be safe. That's the whole idea behind these conventions. Back in the day, nerds wanted to get together to celebrate these things because they didn't feel safe. And so they made these conventions as a safe space. We need to maintain that, right? We need to make sure that it's a safe space, and that we look out for each other, and that we find a way to maintain that sense of family. That we're all here to enjoy ourselves, and if anyone is in trouble, they should hopefully feel safe talking out to somebody. And if you can be an ally, that's incredibly important. If someone looks like they need help, ask them, "Are you okay? Do you need some help? Is everything okay?" That's one of the best things you can do, is to be an ally to other people, because sometimes it's hard for people to put it into words. Sometimes people are in a state of just sort of nervousness or anxiety or shock, and it's hard for them to articulate it. So it's good to just walk up and be an ally. Let's all look out for each other and make sure that everybody's feeling okay and feeling safe. Okay? That's my PSA for the panel. Now we can get into the Q&A about stuff, since that's most of what this panel is going to be about. You asking me questions about things, and I will do my best to answer. Before we start doing the Q&A, let me just tell you that there are two subjects that are my favorite to talk about, that I think are often the most enriching, the most enjoyable topics to talk about. The first would be, what does it take to work in the industry? It is my hallucination that as fans of this content, that you may want to work in the entertainment industry in some fashion, either as a voice actor or a writer or a producer or a graphic artist, who knows, right? I'm happy to talk about that in any way that I can. Obviously, most of my expertise is in the field of acting and voice acting, and you may be familiar with a podcast that I do called Voice Acting Mastery. If not, feel free to check it out at voiceactingmastery.com, or go on the iTunes store and search for podcasts. It should pop up under my name. So I'm happy to talk about what it takes to work in the industry. That's topic number one. The second topic I love to talk about is why we love these stories so much. Why we find these stories so enriching to ourselves personally. And what it takes to craft these kinds of stories. You may be familiar with my mythology scholarship. I do presentations at academic conferences and film festivals and conventions. My mythology meaning presentations, where I talk about the different religious influences on pop culture heroes. And why Americans write about superheroes and the Japanese write about giant robots, and why you tend to dress up as the characters, and sort of all the archetypal hero journey stuff going on. So I'm happy to talk about story and character and what makes them work and why they're fascinating and all that kind of stuff. So those are my two favorite topics to talk about, but I'm happy to talk about whatever might please you. It does not look like we have a microphone for the audience, so you'll have to use your outside voice in asking a question, and I will do my best to repeat it to the audience to make sure everybody is on the same page. So, does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
Sorry, it's not one of the topics.
Then I'm leaving. No, I'm kidding. It's fine.
Honestly, last month, I was supposed to be my little brother here. He's at stage 1A melanoma skin cancer, so he's in the hospital. But I put him on Naruto 2 years ago, and he's like, oh my gosh, I love everybody. I love Itachi, I love Sasuke, stuff like that. But he really grabbed a hold to Itachi for some reason. So I was wondering, if maybe after you can assign some posters for him.
We'll see. I mean, I've had 2 autograph sessions already, and the thing is that people waited in line to get that autograph, and so it's not really fair for me to give people basically cuts in line. But why don't you stick around after the panel and we'll see what we can do. Okay?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yes.
So one of my favorite roles that you did was Kyon from Haruhi Suzumiya. So I was just curious, when you got the role, what direction were you given for his character? How did you approach just voicing Kyon in general?
Gotcha. So he was asking, how did I approach playing the character of Kyon in The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya? So for those of you who are not familiar with the show, the premise of the show is the main character, Kyon, hangs out at this school, and he's sort of jaded because he doesn't think life is very interesting. And then into his life comes this crazy girl, Haruhi Suzumiya, who basically says, I'm only interested in talking to aliens, espers, and time travelers, and unless you're one of these, you're dumb and I don't want to talk to you. And what Haruhi doesn't know is that she has this strange power to change the universe. Like, when she thinks something, it happens, but Haruhi doesn't know that. But everyone else who are time travelers, aliens, and espers do know it, and so they have all come in disguise to be school classmates of her, to keep an eye on her so she doesn't destroy the universe. So Haruhi is sort of, bored because there's no one exciting, and what she doesn't know is that all of her friends are excited. So when approaching something like that, Kyon, because he's the normal one, like everyone else has magical powers of some way or another, Kyon's the normal character, so he's what we call in storytelling the window character, right? This is the character we're going to see the story through. And often that's the character that is closest to us, because very few of us, unless there's somebody here who can show me, have magical powers. I'd love to see it. So that window character, it's also very similar to what happens in Lord of the Rings, right? Because you have wizards and elves and everything, but the window character in Lord of the Rings is Frodo, because he's more sort of relatable to the average person. So Kyon is the window character, which means that my performance as Kyon has to be as natural and as unassuming and as unaffected as possible. And then, to put a little more pressure on me, you get to hear inside Kyon's head. Most of the show, it'll jump back and forth between what Kyon says out loud and what he's thinking in his head that we do as a voiceover. So most of the time I'm talking as Kyon, and then I'll think in my head about something, and then I'll talk about myself as Kyon again, right? And so this sort of back and forth in and out of my head, I never shut up, right? The movie version of Haruhi Suzumiya is 2 hours of me never shutting up. It took us a whole month to record that movie, like 45 hours in the booth to get 2 hours of final footage for the movie. So, while that is taxing on a psychological level, Kyon's voice is not like Alucard or Winston, where he's like technically challenging. You know, I'm just trying to be a little lighter in my tone and be as natural as possible. But after a while, your eyes start to cross and you can't think. And also your voice does get tired. We found out that I couldn't do it for more than 4 hours, because after 4 hours, my voice would start to get a little tired and I'd start to sound deeper. And then I was like, okay, don't sound like a high school kid anymore. That's not gonna work. But most of it was psychological and staying focused and staying relaxed and being in that natural state. And because that's what I want. And that was especially a challenge in the movie, because in the movie I would talk for long periods of time. Like I might talk for 5 minutes straight. And the problem is that, you may not realize this, but when we're recording, we have to record sort of one line at a time. And so it'd be like trying to have a conversation only one line at a time. And what you will find is, as you're doing this, you will end up repeating your melodies, and you'll find out that you're doing the same tones over and over again, no matter what. You happen to be saying, right? And it gets really pedantic, and it sounds totally fake. And so when we would go, I would have to, usually we only get like 3 or 4 seconds of pre-roll before we have to say our line. I would turn to the engineer and say, I need like 15 seconds. I need to hear the melodies that I was speaking with, 10, 15 seconds before where I'm about to speak, so I don't repeat my melodies. And the engineer thought I was out of my mind. He's like, what, did you suddenly become a bad voice actor, Crispin? And I'm like, no, you don't understand. This is really hard. When it's a back and forth, when I say something and you say something and I say something, the melodies don't repeat as much. It's not as difficult. But when I'm narrating 2 hours straight, and it has to sound like it all happened in one take, that's not easy at all. So that was most of the challenge, was to make Kyon sound like I wasn't acting, while I'm sweating in the booth to make sure that it sounds as smooth and sort of unaffected as possible. Good question. In the red hat.
Yeah, I have 2 questions, both involve Hellsing. So since you're an expert on these like literary, mythological archetypes and whatnot.
I study. I'm not sure you'd call me in front of a court as an expert, but I study. Yes, go for it.
How would you identify the character of Alucard in all of that? So, from like that perspective.
Are you looking for the type of character that Alucard is? I mean, he's a vampire.
Well, like archetype character.
Archetype character. Well, I'm not sure if there's an official, Norton English guide to archetypes that would sort of name Alucard, but I would call Alucard, I like to call him a sort of hurricane character. Meaning that he's sort of like the Incredible Hulk. Like he sort of pulls all the stops at some point and it all just goes crazy. I end up playing these characters from time to time. Shizuo and Durarara is like that. He's sort of an Incredible Hulk. In a way, Winston is too in Overwatch. Winston is usually mild-mannered, but when he goes primal rage, get out of his way, So you have these sort of hurricane-type characters that can do that sort of thing. But all those have very different motivations. Winston's motivation and Shizuo and Alucard's motivation are all very different. So that might give you a sort of rough idea of the type of character. You still have to sort of drill down and figure out what motivates them psychologically in order to play them effectively.
And the other question, you're familiar with Hellsing Ultimate Abridged?
I am.
There's one line I would want, one Alucard line from that show that I would want you to do it in your regular Alucard voice. Could you do it?
Oh, you know.
All right. The line is, interrupt my story again and see what happens.
Interrupt my story again and see what happens. All right, let's go on the right side here. Or my right, your left. Stage right.
Okay. I actually have a request there about a Tachi's voice. Would you be able to do a line from when you were talking to Sasuke?
I can play the voice of Itachi. Next question.
It was the one that starts with, there is no value in killing the likes of you.
Sure, there's no value in killing the likes of you.
Yeah, this is like the full sentence.
I don't remember the line from 10 years ago, so there's no value in killing the likes of you. Is that what the line is?
There is no killing the likes of you, false little brother. If you wish to kill me.
I'm sorry, I can't remember all that. And it's a shame because you were in line with me for autographs and I would have been happy to do the line then. And, we could do, a voice actor jukebox here. But it'd be great to sort of elevate the level of the discussion. There's all sorts of cool things we could talk about. And you can play the DVD all day long. So, I'll do you a Natasha line. Ready? Little brother, you don't have enough hate. And you know what? You never will. All right, over here. Yes, in the Richard.
Oh, hi. Okay, so to Hellsing again, I sort of saw this right away because you mentioned you were myths and mythology and stuff. What do you think about the Hellsing story itself? Because, Toronto sort of takes a lot of his background mythos and sort of squishes it together. What do you think about, Alucard?
Right.
Background, because he's he's Dracula, and then he's also, from Wallachia. It's just a lot in there. What do you think? How do you think? What do you think about the story?
Right. So what do I think about the sort of mythological background of Hieronymus's Hellsing, his adaptation of the vampire myth? So it's interesting because there's actually, if you go to my mythologyandmeaning.com webpage, which you can find from crispinfreeman.com, there's a link to it. In the media section, there is an interview that I did with Juan Carlos Bagnell about zombies and vampires. And because he's a really big zombie nut, and I really like vampires, so we got together and for like an hour and a half broke down the mythological structuring behind zombies and vampires. So I think you'd find it really interesting. But in a nutshell, Hieronymus is taking the sort of traditional notion of the vampire, started with Polidori's vampire Nosferatu back when Mary Shelley was writing Frankenstein, moving forward with Bram Stoker in his version of Dracula. And the idea is that the vampire always has, underneath the core of the vampire is this notion of taboo sexuality. Okay? So when you look back at the older versions of the vampire is always a little bit beyond the pale of what is acceptable at the time. So when you go back to the original Bram Stoker vampire, the first person he feeds on is Jonathan Harker, which is a homosexual relationship, which at the time was inappropriate, no longer. Also, he came from Eastern Europe. It was written by an Englishman, and the people in Western Europe sort of looked at Eastern Europe as having bad blood. Like we didn't want that gypsy blood coming and adulterating our good, pure, upstanding women in Britain. And so there's a lot of that. Now, the reason for that is because it's sort of titillating and salacious when it's sort of, ooh, this is forbidden, The thing is, though, is that our sexuality as humans, what's sort of acceptable keeps expanding, right? As it should, as we sort of expand what we think is acceptable. And so you have to keep pushing the envelope to see what could be sort of salacious and taboo. And so when Hellsing first came out, in the anime at least, in 2002, it was all BDSM. It was all master-slave stuff, right? Because back then that was really sort of titillating and salacious. Well, now we have 50 Shades of Grey. Like everybody's reading it on the plane. It's not... So that's sort of where the vampire lore works. What Hieronymus is doing is he's sort of taking that and he's doing another thing with it, which is he's making a comment about Japanese culture. This is something that my friend Helen McCarthy, who wrote the Anime Encyclopedia, talked about years ago, in that sometimes an author will want to talk about their own country, but they'll set the story in a different country because it gives them a clearer metaphor. So she talked about Memoirs of a Geisha, which is written by a British man about England, but it's set in Japan. Now, Hieronymus has done the reverse. He's taken a show that he wants to talk about Japan, and he set it in England. Now, there's a good reason for this, why there's this sort of English-Japanese crossover. It's because there's a lot of similarities between these two countries. They're both island nations. They both have been empires. They both have very strict rules about social manners and protocol. They both like tea. There's a lot of parallels between Japan and Great Britain. And so what you're seeing in Hellsing is this sort of interesting thing, because there's something about Hieronymus wanting to go back to some sort of traditional culture. Do you need something?
Is there a problem with the projector?
No, we're not using it.
Okay. Not sure what that was about then.
Okay, thank you. Hirano-san is trying to say something about Japanese culture and this notion of trying to stick to some sort of traditional notion of Japanese culture, which is why the Hellsing organization looks like the British Museum. Like it's this old school sort of dyed-in-the-wool sort of organization that's very hidebound. Whereas all the vampires that they're fighting are all sort of trendy and hipstery and techno-forward, and screw them. We want our old traditional vampires, right? So there's sort of an interesting commentary that Hirano-san is making about Japanese culture and sort of sticking to more traditional roots about things. So he's sort of melding all of that stuff together, and guns. Yeah. On the right, you sir.
Since you mentioned that you studied mythology and that kind of thing, I was curious if there was a particular mythological story that sort of kicked everything off, or if it was more just a general interest in the overall idea of, hey, these are interesting stories and how they connect to Robotech.
So he was asking if there was any, you're saying if there's any mythology or any story that sort of kicked off my fascination with mythology? Yeah, so how this happened is that when I was in graduate school in New York City, I was going to Columbia for graduate school, and this was in the late 90s in New York City. And I had a sort of crisis, which can happen in graduate art schools, where you're not sleeping and you're trying to figure out what you want to say as an artist. And I really felt like I was sort of lost. My artistry at the time my acting was not very good. I didn't know what I wanted to say. I didn't know why I was an actor. And in the middle of that, I sort of discovered two things. One, I rediscovered my love of anime. I had always loved anime as a kid, and I'd watched it on television, here in Chicago, actually, on Channel 32, I believe it was, where they would have the Voltron Robotech Power Hour, and they would play Speed Racer, and Battle of the Planets, and Star Blazers, and Robotech, and Voltron, and all this great stuff. But when I got to college, I sort of lost touch with that, because I was in college in the early 90s. While I was on the internet, the World Wide Web didn't even exist yet, so you didn't have access to this sort of stuff until I got to New York in the late 90s, and there was a store in New York called Anime Crash that sold anime on VHS tapes. Right? And the Sci-Fi Channel at the time was doing something called Saturday Morning Anime, where they would play anime as a Saturday morning cartoon. And so I was like, great, here's my anime, I want to watch my anime. At the same time, I had also discovered Joseph Campbell's work on comparative mythology, right? Specifically, his documentary series, The Power of Myth, which is a series that Bill Moyers produced, where he went and interviewed Joseph Campbell for it's a 6-episode documentary series, which you can now watch on Netflix. It is now on Netflix, which is awesome. So I highly recommend it. Where he talks to Joseph Campbell about his mythology, his mythological studies, and how it influenced Star Wars, and sort of how all this storytelling came about. So what happened then was I had Joseph Campbell and his scholarly work became a sort of decoder ring. He became my Rosetta Stone to unpack why I loved my Japanese animation so much, right? He was able to bring to my conscious mind why I was so subconsciously attracted to Japanese animated storytelling. And then it was sort of off to the races, because I was like, oh my God, I think this is what I'm about as an artist. You know, I love archetypal hero journeys and fairy tales and legends and those kinds of big, long body, as they say in Native American stories. You know, it's about the journey of your entire life. And so that's where I was off and running. And then the thing about Joseph Campbell, though, is as wonderful as a scholar as he is, he didn't really care about pop culture. His idea of pop culture stopped in the 1920s with James Joyce. Like, he never really got past any of that. So I was like, okay, can I apply what Campbell is talking about to superheroes and giant robots? And then I was sort of off to the races with things. Let's go on the left here. Let's do you, sir, in the black hoodie.
Okay, how do you go about picking, like, your characters that you voice act?
I do not pick the characters that I voice act. Simple, yeah. No, this I think is a misunderstanding that people might have about the acting process. So as an actor, I develop my skills, and I try to market my skills to people who might need them, like producers who are trying to put together projects. I also now have an agent who helps represent me, and oftentimes producers will go to that agent and say, hey, we're looking for some actors to play these characters. So what we as actors will get are audition sides. We'll get samples of the character and little bits of the script that they want us to audition as the character. And nowadays what happens is we get them at home via email and we record them in our home studio and then we email them back to our agent as MP3 files and then the agent uploads it to a website and the producers listen to all the MP3s and then they decide who to hire. So I don't choose my characters. The producer decides whether they're going to hire me or not. Now, sometimes an agent will send me a whole bunch of characters, right? And there's no time to choose the characters for me. So let's say there's a big video game and there's 20 or 30 different characters. Sometimes my agent will just say, here's 20, 30 characters. Pick the 3 or 4 that you think you are best for, right? That you have the best chance of booking. And then I'm going, okay, I'm going to choose this character, those characters. I think those I have the best chance of getting cast for. And then I'll submit those. But then it's up to the producer to decide whether to hire me or not. And there's been plenty of shows that I've worked on where I was thinking, I might like to play that character, but I got cast as the other character instead because I have no control over the process. You bet. Let's do in the back, the gray shirt, I think.
Was there any other characters that you auditioned for in Overwatch? And was there anything that was particularly exciting about Overwatch when it was coming out?
Yeah. I'm being serenaded with music from the 1930s. Yes, it's interesting. So I auditioned for Overwatch not knowing what it was because back then they weren't saying anything and it was all under a code name. It wasn't the same name. And so I got an audition. I got an audition from Blizzard, and it was for this character named Winston. And he was a gorilla, and he was from the moon. And so I did my best job auditioning for that character. And Matt, could you try to find out what's going on? Sorry, I mean, it's lovely. I feel like I'm in, some Nelson Eddy Jeanette MacDonald movie from the 1930s or 40s, or some Marx Brothers movie, but it's a little distracting. I guess maybe it's stuff. So as you can imagine, he was one of the earliest characters they were auditioning for, right? Which I didn't know until later how important Winston was. So I booked Winston and we recorded Winston. Now since then, they have sent auditions for other characters, and sometimes I will ask my agent, do they really want me auditioning for McCree? I'm already playing Winston. I don't think this is gonna work. But I think at one point I did audition for McCree, which was silly. I don't know, I probably shouldn't have. I think at this point, we as our Overwatch characters are just going to play our characters, and the chances of us playing another one are very slim. Because the nice thing about Overwatch is they really, and you'll see this if you watch any YouTube videos of the voice actors for Overwatch talking about their characters, we really are our characters. There's something really sort of authentic about how we play these characters and where they come from sort of deep in our psyche. And so you really couldn't replace this with anyone else, I don't think. I auditioned for McCree, but it wasn't until I heard Matt Mercer talk about his love of Americana and sort of his love of Western culture and even the kitschiness of Americana that I was like, dude, you are McCree, right? You be McCree, I'm gonna be the gorilla from the moon because that's where I'm from. That's my bailiwick, So yes, I have auditioned for other Overwatch characters, but at this point, there's no point. I'm certainly not going to play Baptiste. My God, you in the black shirt there.
Oh, I have a production question.
Oh, well, you are in a white shirt, but you in the black shirt.
Hi there. For the Hellsing Ultimate commentary, it seemed like you did a lot of research between the Hellsing anime and the Hellsing Ultimate. And during episode 1, you made a comment about how Alucard says he has a sense of whimsy now, right, which he didn't in the anime. And I don't think you ever got to go in depth on that. So if you could explain the comment about how he has whimsy in this version.
Right. So it's this interesting thing that we did, which is we did an entire TV series of Hellsing, and then we went back and did an OVA series of Hellsing. And the plots diverge because when the anime TV series, the first one was being done, the manga hadn't been finished yet. And so like Game of Thrones, they got ahead of the book. And so they had to create a big bad guy, incognito, from the TV series that never shows up, as far as I know, in the manga, right? But when the manga was finally finished, they went back and did another anime OVA series where they hewed much closer to the manga storyline. So this is the interesting thing about character. People like to separate character and plot. You can't really. You don't understand a character unless you see them take actions in a plot. And a plot can't move forward unless there are characters in it pushing it forward. So the two are sort of inextricably linked. So one might say, well, you've already played Alucard in the TV series. You're playing the same character in the OVA. No, I'm not, actually. They are similar. They are motivated from a similar place. But because the plot has changed, we're going to reveal different aspects of the character that would not have been revealed in the first version. And one of the big changes was in the first episode of the OVA, Integra asks Alucard why he turned Ceres Victoria into a vampire. Now, in the original TV series, he abdicates responsibility. He basically says, you know, she did it herself. She asked for it. That wasn't me, you know? And Integra gets sort of pissy with him and goes, it's time to go home. It's time for us to leave. And so it never really is explored exactly what his meanings are. But in the OVA, Integra says, why did you do this? And the energy between them at that point is different. She's not as accusatory as she was in the original series. And so Alucard now has the room to talk about it. And he goes, well, you know what? I don't know. I think I just wanted to be playful. I wanted to have some whimsy. From my perspective, how I justify that psychologically for Alucard is that Alucard is incredibly bored. When you are that powerful, and you are royalty, and you are surrounded by peasants, you are incredibly bored. You are just dying for someone to have a good fight with. You've got no playmates, right? And so that's why he was basically inactive, you know, in sort of hibernation, until someone came along that was interesting to him, which was Integra. And they show that in the OVA. This young girl, Integra, has more spine and more gumption and chutzpah than any of the adults around her. And so Alucard says, you, Integra, I will serve you because that will be fun. And I will be your servant. I will be your slave, and you can be my master, because that sounds like a fun game. Can we play that game? Huh? Tell me when I can kill people. Please tell me when I can kill people, right? And so that's that whole releasing control art restriction. Like, he has to get permission before he can release the dogs of war, right? Because otherwise he could just kill everybody instantly, and it's really boring. So he's going to play this game. Well, at some point he decided, well, maybe I want to be the master and someone else can be my slave, right? And I don't think he actually started that with Ceres. I think he started with Ceres hoping she might be an equal. You know, going, come on, Ceres, you could be a vampire like me. And Ceres is like, no, I don't want to drink the blood. And he goes, oh, so you want to be told what to do. You don't want to be my equal, you want to be my slave. Fine, then I'm calling you Police Girl. No, that's not my name. It is now Police Girl, right? Because you're my servant. So that's where his sense of whimsy came in. He said, you know what, maybe I'll try being the master this time and see how that works out. Maybe that'll be fun. Let's go on the left here, in the blue.
So, you know, going back to Overwatch,
yeah.
A lot of times, you know, we have to kind of pick the story just from like the interactions between different characters.
Right.
And so with Winston, have you had any like difficulties? Like, since you know a lot of in-game cutscenes, you know, you can talk to people and you can see how they're interacting. But when it's just a spawn room and everyone's just spawning in, you know, you can't really figure out, you know, like what kind of like direction do you have in those interactions with other people.
Right, so he's saying that the thing about Overwatch is that there is the linear storytelling aspect of Overwatch, which are the animated shorts that you can watch on YouTube. But then there's aspects of the story and the history of the characters that is revealed only when you're playing the game and the characters are sort of interacting with each other in the game. And what you get are these little one-liners or these little interactions between two characters that sort of hint at their history, but don't always reveal that much. Right? And you're saying, how do I handle that as an actor? Well, when we're recording for those sort of isolated battle lines, we'll get a whole block of lines, and usually I can just go through them and it's no big deal. It's over here, do that. That's good. You know, like it's nothing too specific. But every once in a while, I'll get a line, and I don't understand the context of it. It clearly is trying to say a message, but I don't know where it's from. Sometimes they're like Carl Sagan lines from Cosmos, and I'll recognize them. I'll be like, is this from Cosmos? Or like at one point when he was like the Yeti, they did a whole thing from I don't know if it's not Frosty, but I think it may be Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer or one of the Rankin Bass animated, stop-motion animated things where they have the Yeti, they have the Abominable Snowman in the movie. And I was like, is this a thing from the Rankin Bass animated film? They're like, how did you know that? I was like, because I love those films, right? So sometimes it's just references, but other times it is commentary. Like, for instance, it's the campaign they have now, the Storm Rising, isn't that what it's called? Yeah, Storm Rising. I was mixing it with Retribution. No, Storm Rising, where it's like the Retribution thing, where you're going on a little bit more of a narrative storyline. And so there were interactions that I was having with Mercy in Storm Rising that I had to get some explanation from the director, because Mercy was asking me about my health. And they had to say, oh, well, when you first came from the moon, your bones were brittle because you'd lived on the moon a sixth of Earth's gravity. And so you had to be careful or else you might fracture your spine and do horrible things. And I was like, oh, really? You know? So some of this is we sort of find out as we're going along. But that's usually what happens is if I'm in the booth and a line comes up and I need more background about it, I'll just turn to the director or the writer. And often that's what happens when you're recording. I'm in the booth, the director is there, and the writer is also there, or on like phone patch. And so, and often it's Michael Chu, right? And many times Michael's in the room with us. And I'll say, Michael, what's this about? He goes, so, this is what I'm like, oh, really? You know, so sometimes I'm finding out in the room as we go.
Do you want a banana?
No, I do not want a banana. But I do have a crippling addiction to peanut butter. Anyone on the right? No, you, sir. Okay, I'll have you in the jacket. I'll take it this time.
All right, so projection question, and this relates to, you know, so say for example, DC Douglas. His website has like a very clear like layouts, and he's been getting like outside calls for like you know, doing bits and rolls and whatnot in comparison to doing going through a dubbing company and whatnot. But when I look at another actor's websites, all they have is like a Gmail address for like personal questions. And well, I have plans on like doing like you know, a Kickstarter project, and there's other like you know, people that probably want to start lower tier like projects. So my question is that is it better to ask the actor directly if you have a specific cast in mind, or is it better to play the non-re game and deal with the production to, you know, hope you get what you want?
I'm not sure I understand. It sounds like you're trying to put together an animated project. Is that true?
Not necessarily animated. It's more video game-ish.
Okay, so you're trying to put together a video game project.
Right.
And you would like to hire voice actors to work on your video game project.
That's correct.
Okay, so here is the challenge, is that you have to decide whether you are going to try to use union talent, actors who are a part of the actors union, or non-union talent. If you are just starting out, you can just approach non-union talent and negotiate whatever fee and pay them that fee to do on your project, okay? If your project is compelling enough, you might be able to get people to collaborate with you just because they think it's an interesting project, right? For those of us who are members of the Actors Union, we have certain rules that we must abide by, both for our safety and for yours as the producer, to make sure that we're both living up to our obligations professionally, okay? One of those is that if you are going to do something union as a video game, you need to become what's called a union signatory. What that means is that you sign a contract with the union saying that you will abide by the union's rules, right? Because if you don't, then they want to have some way of saying, hey, you signed a contract, you can't renege on what you signed, right? They can't just do it over the phone. You know, they need to make sure that you are a legitimate business person and you're not going to flake, you're not going to abuse the actors, you're going to pay appropriately, whatnot. And then there are certain minimums that you need to pay the actors in order to work on your project. Now, it turns out that this, for independent video games, has become a lot easier than it's ever been before. The Actors Union has just put out, and I've been part of this, me and Sarah El Mali. You may have seen Sarah El Mali in a bunch of news stories recently. She's all over the place. She's great. She's a dynamo. She's been very instrumental in putting together what we call the low-budget video game contract that allows you to use union actors even on smaller video games. So we talk about certain games like Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, which was done under the low-budget agreement and has all sorts of voice actors in it, Dave Fennoy and Cissy Jones, and I believe Sarah's in it as well as Sting, right? They got Sting to do a voice in it. So that's pretty cool. So my advice to you would be go to the SAG-AFTRA website. That's the name of the Actors Union. And there hopefully should be a section there where you can contact the voiceover department and say, hi, I'm an independent game developer, and I'm interested in your low-budget agreement for video games. And there's two Katies there, Katie Watson and Katie Sikkema. And they're both really wonderful, and they would love to help you with any of that. If you have any problems with that, and you're having difficulties contacting them, you can go to my website, and there's a contact form on my website, and you can email me there. And just make sure to put in the subject line of your email, low budget video game contract. So I know that's what you're wanting to talk about. And if you're having any problems talking to the right person at the union, I'm happy to put you in touch with the right person to see if you can work it out.
Thank you very much.
You bet. On the left, in the blue hat.
How are you doing today, Mr.
Good.
Good. My question is what you said when you came in. You said that in America we have heroes. In Japan they have robots. I'm a robot fan from back in the 70s.
Right.
So could you elaborate on that more?
Sure. So I would say that if you took any average Japanese boy and every average American boy and you sat them down and you asked them to write a comic book, chances are that Japanese boy would tend to write a comic book about giant robots, and the American boy would tend to write a comic book about superheroes. Why is this, right? That's where my mythology scholarship comes from. When I see those kinds of patterns in storytelling, then I want to figure out what's influencing it. And it tends to be mythology. Mythology is the storytelling aspect of a religion, okay? And it's usually the part of the religion that lasts the longest. So we may not know the details of the rituals of the oracle at Delphi in ancient Greece. We may not know exactly what they wore or what they said, but we've got the stories. The stories survive. And so those stories influence our subconscious and tend to manifest in our storytelling. And so that's your typical Japanese boy. Let me clarify. For girls, it can be a totally different ball of wax. But for the boy, they tend to be giant robots. The American boy tend to be superheroes. Now, I am like you, in that when I was growing up, I liked giant robots, right? And part of why this became fascinating to me is because I was a nice white boy from Chicago, Illinois. Why wasn't the superhero stories enough for me? I mean, I liked Spider-Man and Superman and Batman, they were all great. But what I really went crazy over was Robotech. I mean, Robotech was the bomb. You had the transforming F-14 planes that turned into the Valkyries and it's great, it's awesome. And so that's why I had to sort of dive into it. And I realized that what was happening is the mythology, the storytelling underneath the Japanese stuff was more appealing to my psyche than necessarily the mythology underneath the superhero stuff. And one of the main things that I found so compelling about Robotech specifically is that in superheroes, there's often good guys and bad guys. And there is no reforming of the bad guy, right? The Joker is not going to become sweet and darling and, buy you flowers on Mother's Day. Like, it's not going to happen, right? But our superheroes have to be moral, so they can't kill them. So they put them in Arkham, then they escape. Put them in Arkham, then they escape. Put them in Arkham, then they escape. You'd think they'd improve Arkham, or go somewhere else. Go to Bellevue. Is there somewhere else we can put the Joker? Right? So you have this constant battle of good versus evil, and there's no reforming of that evil. Right? That evil is just inherent. That's not the case in Robotech. In the premise of Robotech, an alien ship crash landed on Earth. They called it the Macross. They figured out how to use the technology. It took them about 10 years, but they reverse engineered the technology from this crashed alien ship and allowed them to make transforming planes that transformed into robots. Really cool. But then 10 years later, the aliens show up wanting their ship back. And now they attack the Earth, and they're called the Zentradi. And the Zentradi are bred for war. That's it. They're just, all they know is war. And so Earth suddenly finds itself in this battle between trying to fight off the Zentradi. Well, 2/3 of the way through the story, the Zentradi basically destroy most of the Earth, right? Like, game over. What do we do? And what happens is the humans in the Macross are able to finally defeat the Zentradi, but they defeat them not by killing them, but by learning to live with them. Actually, one of the big things is that one of the star pilots for the humans and one of the star pilots for the Zentradi fall in love. And they have a kid together, showing that the two races can possibly live together. Now, it's not easy, because the Zentradi want to fight. Like, it's just sort of natural in them. They want to fight. And so they're having to try to learn how to relax and how to, like, live in a culture together. But the last third of the story is basically who is left of the humans and who is left of the Zentradi on the shell of the Earth, trying to figure out how to live together. That's sometimes where I feel like I am right now, right? How do we all live together on this rock without killing each other? Like, there's got to be a way that we can find some sort of mutual respect and find some way to get along. So that, I didn't know it at the time when I was young, but that's why I was so, I had to wait 20 years and do a lot of study to figure it out. But that's at the core, the cosmology of underneath it is what is so appealing to me. And you can see that cosmology in Gundam. You know, like, the Federation and the colonies have to find some way to get along, or Zeon and the Federation have to get along, or else they're just going to kill each other. Like, there's got to be some way to resolve this that doesn't just end up wiping out the other side. And so that's what I found most appealing, specifically about the Giant Robot stuff.
Appreciate it.
You bet. Okay, all sorts of hands. Let's go, I think, in the, yes, you sir, in the black shirt.
The Ragnarok connection in Code Geass. For those of us who don't know very much about Nordic mythology, is there, like, some cool stuff that you could, like, explain about that, help us appreciate it better?
The Ragnarok connection in Code Geass. Remind me again how the Ragnarok thing works in Code Geass.
It's been a while since I've seen it myself, but I remember Ragnarok is like the destruction and rebirth of the world, and
right.
He was trying to, like, use thought elevators, the Britannian Emperor, trying to use that to sort of, like, meld everybody into, like, one giant consciousness, where there's, like, suffering's going to be eliminated and stuff.
Oh, really? Did they do that in Code Geass? It's been so long since I watched the show. You know, and my character sort of went insane, so it was hard for me.
Is Fate Zero more fresh in your memory?
It is. So, obviously, people like to use Ragnarok, which is the sort of end of the world story of Norse mythology. It's at the core of also Wagner's Ring Cycle, Gardameron, the Twilight of the Gods, when the world comes to an end. It's something in Wolf's Rain, where the sort of whole world is coming to an end. So this notion of Ragnarok is a popular thing. If you're talking about them, like, melding everyone into one huge oversoul, that is actually not Norse. That is actually more Hindu, or possibly Kabbalistic. So where you see that a lot is in Evangelion, where the idea, what Gendo Ikari is trying to do with the Human Instrumentality Project, is to basically unwind creation. And that's why when you look at his office, on the roof of his office, he has the Tree of Life, the Sephirot from Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And the notion is that those circles, there's a pattern to them, and there's what's called a lightning bolt. And so the idea is that everything came from the Ein Sof, which is this sort of undifferentiated consciousness, where there was no you and me, all was one. And then there was this sort of spark, and the lightning bolt came out, and then what happens at the end is Malkuth, which is the world. Where there are pairs of opposites, and you are you, and I am me, and we are not the same. And so Gendo, because he misses his wife, is trying to reverse that process because he wants to go be with his wife. And so there may be something similar happening in Britannia. That notion of an oversoul is very much an Asian mythology sensibility. You will find that in Hinduism, Atman, the idea that there is the one soul, and we are the Jiva Mukti, we are the sort of spark of that one soul come down, and when we reincarnate, we will go back to that one soul and back and forth and whatnot, and that's why we reincarnate over and over. That notion of an oversoul doesn't really exist in Abrahamic traditions. Right? The idea of the Ein Sof in Kabbalah it's similar to the Atman, but it's more the mind of God than the universe and an oversoul. And also the Kabbalah is a relatively recent creation in Jewish religious tradition. The Zohar and the book of the Zohar that was written in the Middle Ages. You know, it doesn't have the ancient pedigree that, say, the book of Isaiah does, or anything from the Tanakh or from the Torah. So, you know, it's a sort of more recent take on things, and who knows how the Zohar was influenced by later traditions, because that notion of Atman could come... What? Oh, 5 minutes, thank you. That notion of Atman was being developed in the Upanishads in like 500 in the Axial Age, like 500 BCE, before the Common Era, the Upanishads and the Buddha, and there were all sorts of crazy stuff going on in religious traditions in Asia. And so who knows, maybe that stuff had filtered to Jewish scholars by the Middle Ages, and so when, I can't remember the guy who wrote the Zohar, said, ooh, I want to take some of that and include that in the Kabbalah, you know, so there's crossover. But usually the idea is, in the afterlife, in the Abrahamic traditions, you don't become one with God. You are in the presence of God, right? Being in heaven, you still are you, and you get to see God, right? And so in heaven, I get to see all of you, and you are still you, and I am still me, and we are still separate. In Hinduism, we are not. There is no separation between us. We are just one big soul with no individual egos. So that's why you'll see that sort of Hindu notion show up over and over again, often in Asian storytelling, because it's just percolated up through the culture over millennia. That's sort of where that stuff comes from. And that's, in my mythology scholarship, that's what I'm doing. I'm sort of tracking these structures and how they influence storytelling. All right, in the blue shirt.
Well, this is probably about 15 years ago. What was your process for coming up with getting a character for Balmung from the .hack series?
In Balmung, I actually replaced another actor. And the challenge they had is that the original actor was a little casual. He sounded a little Californian. And they realized that Balmung needed to be a little more knightly and a little more aristocratic, which is something I have some experience with. And so they brought me in to play Lord Balmung because they wanted more of that sort of knightly, princely character. So that's what I was channeling for Balmung. All right, one last question, I think, and then we're probably going to be out. Yes, you.
Okay, so I was thinking back to when you said, like, sometimes you have to go back and, like, listen to your voice to make sure that you're not sounding like a broken record. Was there any voice you did that was, like, really taxing on your voice? Like, I was thinking about, like, Durara, I got to scream, like, Izaya over and over again. So was there any character that was, like, really painful or really taxing on your voice?
Yes, she's asking, is there any character that's really taxing on my voice? And there are. I mean, Alucard is probably the most taxing, because to play Alucard well, I want to be nice and relaxed and groovy and sort of resonant and rah-rah-rah, and then rah, you know, I rip somebody's head off, which is not relaxed and groovy. It makes my voice tense up. So I'm constantly having this battle as Alucard to both stay relaxed and get the viciousness at the same time. But I started Alucard later in my career where I had learned some of that. Where I really made a mistake was early in my career, I played a character in a show called Photon. I played the Galactic Emperor. And he had this voice that was sort of crazy like this, right? Because they told me he was a short character and I wouldn't have to do much. 4 hours later, my voice is not doing so well, right? And it taught me a very valuable lesson. I should not do a voice that I cannot maintain for at least 4 hours, okay? Now what's funny is that I then later learned how to maintain that voice. And we played, there's a game called The Battle for Middle-earth 2, I believe it is. I think it's a real-time strategy game. And I play the voice of the Goblin Commander who sort of guides you how to use the forces of Mordor and whatnot. And I did the Goblin Commander sort of like this. So yeah, this really rough voice. And the guys at EA were like, can you maintain that? And I was like, yes, I can do it for 2 hours, then you need to let me go home and sleep, and then I will come back and do it tomorrow again. Which is the same thing for Fred Tatasciore. Like Fred Tatasciore, when he plays the Incredible Hulk, he says, I can do the Hulk for about 2 hours, and then you need to let me go rest. So you have to figure that out as a voice actor. You have to maintain your instrument and make sure. Every once in a while, I have pushed it too far, and then I have to go on extreme vocal rest, and I basically don't talk for a week to try to allow my vocal cords to recover, because I bruise them. And if I keep bruising them, they will callous up, and then I won't sound the same. But I think I've only hurt myself that badly maybe twice. I think twice I pushed it way too hard. And was like, I'm out, I'm not gonna be able to talk for a week if I wanna sound like myself again once it's all over. So it's very important. You have to keep your instrument healthy if you wanna have longevity as a voice actor. All right, technically time is over. So thank you so much for coming to the panel. It's been great to have you here. In voice acting stuff, check out voiceactingmaster.com. If you're interested in my mythology stuff, mythologyandmeaning.com. Have a great rest of your convention. Take care. Thank you.